Do it.
All right, we are going live, and as everyone enters, I'm so excited that we're going to be doing this today. We're almost to the weekend, we're almost there. And as everyone enters in, I want you to feel comfortable and at home. Happy Friday, everyone.
Indeed.
Yes,
It's not
yes,
quite happy hour, but we're getting
not
there.
quite, but I'm sure there are some of us that are ready for it to be happy hour, and it's an hour and we're happy. So
And after this discussion, everyone will want to have happy hour because it's going to be so enlightening and so fun and enjoyable and filled with things that none of us are dealing with right
and
now.
inspired and inspired.
Inspired.
Let's not forget. Okay. So it looks like we have a bulk of everyone here and we're a minute in. So I want to go ahead and get started. Welcome, everyone. I'm so glad that you're able to make it. You are here live and ready to go for Beyond COVID-19, identifying and addressing today's and tomorrow's critical issues. This is such a great webinar because it's a how-to with usable tools that we're going to share with you. It's going to be very exciting, especially designed for associations assessing knowns and unknowns and developing strategy in today's shifting and parlous environment. I'm trying to find some other way to say uncertain times, right? I'm Kiki L'Italien, Senior Consultant for Tecker International, and I'm here today to MC today's session and moderate your questions with my colleagues at Tecker, Cheryl Williams, Sharon Cox, and Jim Meffert. They are going to share with you from their experience and their expertise to help you better define and address the issues that matter most to your members and to you. So the chat is disabled. You'll notice we don't have that rolling over to this side, but we ask that you please ask your questions. We welcome them in the Q&A, and we're going to try to answer them during today's session. If it happens to be that we get so many questions that we don't get to all of them during the hour, we're going to be sure to follow up afterwards with answers to all of those questions. This is being recorded, and you will receive an email with a link to the replay in 5 to 7 days from now. So with that, Jim, take it away.
Great. Thank you, Kiki. And it's great to have everyone with us. Let me sure we're getting the right thing going here. Yeah, and what we're finding with associations and the organizations that we're working with is right now at this time of uncertainty and crisis, a lot of things are being thrown at leaders. A lot of things that perhaps they didn't expect, a lot of uncertainty, a lot of things that are known and unknown about how to lead at a time when there are a lot of things that are swirling, a lot of issues that are coming to us that we thought might happen in the future that are happening now at this time of this grand experiment that we're going through with COVID and work styles and the changing professions and industries that are impacted by a lot of the external dynamics that are facing us. And so we know that navigating through, balancing what we know and what we don't know, balancing the short-term and long-term actions that we have to take is a challenge. A lot of leaders and a lot of organizations are considering or thinking that they might not have the bandwidth to really think through and go through a process of discerning and thinking about what needs to happen to face some of those issues. And so they're leading from a place of hope and aspiration and thinking about what they want to have happen instead of what's really happening and really facing them. And so we're going to take you through some steps that hopefully will help you think about the actions that you as an organization can and need to take with things that are coming at you, things that you maybe can't impact, things that are much more external than what we're used to with strategic planning or with mega issues or with some of those conversations that we're having with organizations. And what we do know is that the decisions that we make about issues that are affecting us, they also need to complement the direction that we're going. They need to make sure that the organization is doing things that help achieve that mission and vision and the goals. They require deep conversation to make sure that they're complementary. And so as we go through this next hour and have this hopefully enlightening and hopefully fun discussion, we're going to take you through those steps that hopefully will help organizations really intentionally and deliberately think through how to deal with those issues that are facing us right now as leaders. And so to begin that, Sharon's going to take us through the broad framework that we're talking about, so you have some context for this conversation.
So thank you, Jim. Kiki, I hate to say that the future has never been more uncertain than it is today. So I'm using that word. And what this does is implies that leaders need new tools to help them navigate successfully through the rapidly changing environment. So what you see on the screen, the 4C framework, is a tool for enhanced decision making. And it's really a guide to help leaders to identify and develop creative solutions to respond to critical issues that they face now and in the future, even when the path forward is unclear. So considering the vast array of tools that you may see in the marketplace, I first wanted to talk about key attributes and distinguishing characteristics of this model. One, it's designed to build on a body of knowledge as you go through each process to ensure that you truly understand the problem. Also, key stakeholders are involved from the very beginning to help you identify and define the issue. And we use a technique called problem framing principles, where you ask why, like Jim said, maybe 5 times why, but really to explore the known and the unknown. And lastly, quality time is embedded in this process to allow for brainstorming and ideation, which is a key part of design thinking. So if you look at this framework, it really encourages the participants to reimagine the future and think about how can you turn this issue into an opportunity. So next slide, Jim. Let's take a closer look at each step. And I'm just going to give you the highlights because Cheryl and Jim will walk you through in more detail. When you look at step 1, consult, there are 3 expected outcomes of the first step. 1, you need to begin to develop a problem framing list of questions based on your understanding of the stakeholders' behavior and belief about the future. The second activity is really to engage these stakeholders around a set of core questions and then categorize their response based on the internal or external business areas. And lastly, prioritize issues based on urgency and impact. When you move to comprehend, this is when you start to build on that foundational knowledge as it relates to the issue. And those discussions will revolve around who are the key stakeholders, what are their needs, and what is driving that change. The answers to these and other questions will help you to determine whether you will engage in type 1 or type 2 action planning. So when you move to step 3, construct, this is really the core activity in this overall framework. Participants will begin to brainstorm solutions based on the insight gained during the comprehend stage. So if you think about type 1, it's very similar to, if anyone has worked with Tecker, of the mega issue. And we lead the discussion by asking 4 key questions. And again, it's a single focus strategy where participants ask, how can we solve this issue? And at the outset, we have determined, and we will continue to talk about this, but we have determined that there are more knowns and unknowns here, and that the knowns are critical. Type 2 is a little different, and most of us have been engaged with scenario planning in the past, but it really looks at what if and how can we respond. And we really examine our response strategy over a period of time. So we look at different time horizons. And in this case, we determined that there are more unknowns than knowns, and that the unknowns are more important. And then that last step is commit, where participants have determined a plan of action. And this comes as a result of deliberation and consensus building. Also, at this stage, you'll begin to define the roles and responsibilities of the team, create measures to monitor success, and then develop that communication plan for internal and external stakeholders. So Cheryl, please take us through the consult stage.
Thanks, Sharon. So as Sharon outlined, there's two parts to the consult phase: identifying the critical issues and then prioritizing among them. And as you identify the critical issues, you should really focus on listening, learning, and connecting to begin to build your foundation of knowledge, because that's critical to the success of any planning endeavor. Next slide, please. Thanks, Jill. So there are two parts actually to step one. First, you want to make sure, and Sharon alluded to this earlier, that you're hearing from a variety of different voices. So you have your typical stakeholders, your members, your, in some cases, donors, staff, board. So those are the folks that you would normally talk to. You might or might not ask your vendors and customers for perspective as well. But in this instance, we'd really challenge you to look beyond that and to get a diverse set of voices as you think in terms of the critical issues. And when I say diversity, obviously gender, age, and race are in the news right now, but I also want you to think about diversity of type of professional perspective as well. So for example, if you're an association of HR executives or accountants, you might want to talk to folks who work in associations that work with folks like Workday and Salesforce to give you perspective beyond how technology might impact what you're facing as well. So really looking beyond the voices that you normally speak to helps you think about things in a different way. And to be perfectly frank, it can help you eliminate all types of different biases, unconscious or conscious, that you might have from speaking to folks that you've spoken to traditionally. And then part two of step one is, nope, I'm gonna stay on that slide, Jim. Part two is about what you ask, about the actual questions. And Sharon talked about the importance of the questions that you ask when we were introduced to the model. So here are some questions, and what's important about them is that they focus on behaviors as well. If there were a program or service that you need today, what would it be? So those are examples of some of the questions, and any of us at Techer can give you a longer set of questions that might be helpful as well. So we can help you identify other questions that might be affect nonprofits, associations across different industries. Next slide, Jim, please. I do want to also note that as you think about the questions that you ask, while we're focusing on the current environment, that's the title of the slide, it's a missed opportunity while you're talking to folks not to look beyond a year or two from now and ask folks what's on their minds for the future as well. So we are focusing on understanding the current environment, and that's critical. But while you're taking the time and making the investment to talk to folks, ask about what they're thinking about. And I know some folks hate the expression new normal, but there will be one day. And I haven't heard a better expression than new normal. So if somebody has a better expression, just like the other one we talked about earlier, share that in the comments. I'd love to hear it. I'll use that for the time being.
What's normal? What's normal?
Yeah, that's right. That's why people don't like it. But again, you didn't give me an alternative. So anyway, once we get to whatever that is, what issues are you going to face? How will the world have changed? So while you're talking to these folks, think about those sorts of questions as well. So on this slide, as far as how you do it, this is really worth taking some time and investing in having these conversations. But a lot of us don't have a lot of time. So this might be a step where you might want to engage external support, particularly if you're using the more traditional methodologies outlined in bullet one: survey, telephone conversations, focus groups, town halls. Some of those can be contracted out rather easily before the rest of the process gets started to help manage your time and availability and your focus, although you'll certainly want to be part of identifying who to speak to and what questions are asked. However, if in addition there are a lot of other ways to gather information, particularly outlined in the second bullet. If you haven't spent a lot of time in these channels and social media, now might be a really good time to start. And I recognize, it's funny to me when people call social media new media, because it hasn't been new in a long time. I think that's, it's now traditional. It's not new, and it's part of our current tradition. But we always, at Techer, we always recommend starting by listening and observing the norms of different groups before you jump into conversations, whether it's an ASAE Collaborate group or a LinkedIn group, whatever it is, kind of get a sense of the norms. But also, once you've done that and feel that you have something that you can add, be generous, share your perspective as well. And then you can use that opportunity to put some of the questions that you've identified in step one out there and start to get a diverse set of perspectives on those questions for the current environment and for the future as well. Next slide, Jim.
Yeah, Cheryl, it's interesting right now when you mentioned the new methods, which aren't so new. This is this grand experiment we're going through with different work patterns and different ways of communicating and using Zoom and electronic communications and folks at home more than perhaps in the office or traveling. It's a really good time to test, we're finding, to test how your members are engaging and to really not make any assumptions about how they're engaging and getting information and talking with networks, but to really do some testing and examining. That's something that we're finding really interesting right now. There's also a bit of a catharsis going through or counseling that's going through some of these conversations about asking what's different, what's changed, what do you think is going to stick with some of these questions? What do you think the future will be like? How do you think this is going to translate to either the way our members' lives are like or ours or the audience we serve? It's a really, really interesting time to be examining and looking at these issues.
Yeah.
And listening and learning.
Listening and learning. Yes.
I wanted to butt in and say that I am watching the Q&A. We're not getting a ton of questions, but we did get a comment from Glenn. I think we all know Glenn, who says, "How about no normal or multiple normals or a normal normal?"
Well, there's some of us. There's some of us who live under the assumption. And again, we shouldn't assume, but we live under the assumption that tomorrow will be different than yesterday. And we need to think about what happened yesterday and what we're doing today that will lead to something different tomorrow. And so that framework, that assumption that builds into us that tomorrow will be different. We know that it may be differenter as a result of this. In fact, I was having that exact conversation with an association this morning. And so we need to think about what's moving, what's transitioning, what those trends are that will make tomorrow different than yesterday.
Cheryl, I wanted to ask you to maybe talk a little bit about the outliers. You know, before we had the meeting today, we were going through, and I know that one of the things that we talked about the last time was talking about, you were talking about how critical it is to consider the outliers. So could you say something about that?
That is a perfect lead into this slide, Kiki. Thank you very much. So the next step before prioritization is categorization, because if you've done your job well in the previous step, identifying a broad range of folks to talk to and asking questions to get the information you want, behavioral questions, you've got a lot of information at this point. You've got a lot of raw data. So categorizing it is helpful. And we at Techer have suggested some categories, but it's really critical not to force fit everything into these categories. There may be ones that are specific to your nonprofit, your association, your industry, but there may be ones that really stand out among all the rest. And it's easy to put those aside, They involve more work or more time to figure them out. They might involve follow-up, but those are where you can really find exciting nuggets and gems and get you thinking differently than you have in the past. So thanks for asking that question about the outliers. They are really critical. And while it can take more time, it's a good investment of time to consider whether they really are kind of outliers or whether there's something there that can be valuable to you or your association as you identify what issues you may not have previously considered. And with that, I will turn it over to Jim to talk about prioritization.
Yeah, and we're finding too, it's really important to look at the issues affecting the association and look at issues affecting the members. You know, in the healthcare space right now, there's a lot of issues that are affecting specialty societies and healthcare related organizations and the way they function, the way they operate in governance and decision making. But there are also a whole lot of issues that are affecting members, virtual visits, different payment structures, changes in HIPAA, all those things that we know are going to have a longer term impact on the way that delivery the way that healthcare delivery occurs. So it's really important to think about both of those as you think about the future of the association and how you develop either actions or scenarios around those.
You know,
So once
I've noticed working with a lot of groups that when they look at the membership and they look at internal business, they believe they know everything about that. So they're really emphasizing those are the knowns and maybe what the association needs or the economic conditions are the unknowns. But truly take the time to explore knowns versus unknowns and don't take for granted that you do know.
Yeah, no, that's Sharon, you're so right on. And one thing that we know that becomes magnified at a time of uncertainty and crisis and things coming at us that we don't have control over is that we jump to the way we wish things were instead of testing the way they really are. And so really this process is designed to help make sure that you're testing yourself as you go through this also, so that you're not being aspirational, but really building that foundation of knowledge that helps test all of your assumptions. So once we have that list together, it's important for us to prioritize. Organizations are going through this process in different ways. Some takes longer, some shorter, but when you've got a list of things that are affecting us, it's important for us to think that perhaps we can't impact them all right now, but we need to have some intentional conversations about those that we are imagining have the greatest breadth and depth of importance, that have the greatest impact on our association and our members, that perhaps might lead to other things also. And along with that, that timing, that sense of urgency, things that are happening today that we know we need to deal with, or things that we think are coming down the road that we probably will have to deal with in the future. And so having an assessment that identifies either high impact or low impact, or high sense of urgency or low sense of urgency is important here, so that we can identify which issues we're going to deal with first. So this matrix.
Jim, I'm just going to jump in for a second
please.
and say that definition of urgency is really critical, because where we live right now, so many things feel urgent, and we really need to balance urgency versus importance versus time sensitivity. So I think that definition of what is truly urgent is critical as you think through all the competing demands that we face right now.
Cheryl, that's exactly right. And simply taking the time to think about the urgency, to think about the impact, even taking a few minutes, just taking that step back and reminding yourself, how urgent is this? How important is this? That is this something we need to deal with, or are there other things that perhaps we need to deal with first? Just taking that few minutes, either personally or as an organization, is absolutely essential when you have so many things that you think you need to deal with. So once you've gone through this and you've taken that list and you've identified impact and urgency, the first things obviously you want to deal with are those that you have identified are high impact and high urgency. Those things that we know are going to affect us, that we need to deal with today. We've all gone through this with events. We've all gone through this with work patterns, with our staff. We've all gone through this with changes in our communities. And so those are the things that we know are change that we need to deal with right away. The next in line are those that we know are going to have a high impact and perhaps may take a little more time or may be impacted by something else. They have a little bit less sense of urgency. After that are those that have a high sense of urgency, but aren't going to impact us quite as much. Those things that maybe aren't quite within our bandwidth or our swimming lane as an association. And then finally, the last list are those things that can wait. Those things that are low impact, low urgency, that we've identified are issues that we may need to deal with, but frankly, they may be someone else's issue to deal with also. And so taking this step of prioritizing so that we have that list of things that we're going to start with, things that we need to work on right away, things that that help us, that help give us a sense of what we need to do and what we need to act on right now is a really important step in this process. Any other questions from Glenn or others?
There are no questions coming in.
Wow, Cheryl and Sharon are doing everything perfect then.
You know, it's like it's Friday and people are so they're obviously you're captivating all of them.
And they've already started happy hour, Kiki.
Yeah, right. I know. We're playing in the background.
There's just water in here,
Good.
I promise.
You know, one thing I wanted to emphasize before we move to the next phase is that you gather quite a bit of information during the consult phase. And even though you're prioritizing and going to look at one, possibly two issues, the data that you collect during this phase is very important and really should be part of the archives. Because as you move forward, you may need to reach back in, look at some of those stakeholder questions and concerns. As you move forward, you may have to come up with some additional scenario planning. So don't throw this piece away after you've done the prioritization.
Yeah, it will help you identify trends also. It'll help you identify assumptions and measure against those. Yeah, it'll help you with your strategic planning process and update also. Yeah, all of those
It'll
are
provide
linked.
you a benchmark for the future as well.
Yeah. Good.
So I guess we'll move then to comprehend since there was no questions under consult. And just for introduction, the comprehend stage really highlights the importance of building a strong knowledge base. And we've been talking about this over and over again. But you do need to have a strong knowledge base before you make critical decisions. And if you think about it, yeah, it's always true, but during these difficult times, we tend to be a little bit more reactive than proactive. So by pausing, asking those 4 knowledge-based questions you see on the screen, you really are demonstrating to all the participants and to external stakeholders that you are engaging in a credible and trustworthy process. And I think I can hear Glenn say this over and over again. These 4 knowledge-based questions, they do just that, demonstrate that it's a credible process. If you think about the benefits of asking these 4 questions, the first is that, back to the beginning, this demonstrates that you're listening and learning from key stakeholders, understanding their needs, wants, and preferences. But if you think about asking additional questions, you're looking at the drivers of change. And one of the things I'm going to highlight later is that in asking questions, you may have answered this during your strategic planning process. And so you really need to go back to that document and identify what has changed. But looking at the current realities and evolving dynamics means you're looking at those drivers of change. And you're also looking at how these have impacted overall capacity, which could be technology, finance, it could be your workforce, or your strategic position with regards to the products and services in the marketplace. So think about this, that these questions really exemplifies your commitment to staying true to your mission and your values. And by exploring those ethical implications, you're really keeping that focus. So start the comprehend stage with asking these 4 knowledge-based questions. And in some instances, you've asked them when you started your strategic planning process early on. So Cheryl, why don't you take us through stakeholders' needs?
And I saw a question from Dana that I think I can start to try and address in this area of the presentation around stakeholders. So earlier in the consult phase, we listened to and learned from a very broad set of stakeholders. Here in the comprehend stage is where you narrow your focus to your stakeholders, the folks who are most affected or will affect. So either they have an effect on the issues you've identified or they are affected by. So at this point, I invite you to be really specific and start to drill down to your stakeholders. I'm guessing your members and stakeholders aren't monolithic. Neither are your board members or your other stakeholders. Among those large groups, they have common interests, needs, wants, and desires. What's different among them? Which ones are smaller or newer or larger or most mature? They may be interested for academic, political, or philosophical reasons. And to Dana's question, I think that's a great example of how you can't treat all your members the same as you think in terms of translating from a physical conference to a virtual conference, or even, I'm sorry, go ahead, Kiki.
Oh, yes. I would just, for those people who might be calling in or listening on audio, let me go ahead and ask Dana's question. She typed into Q&A. If possible, could we use a specific example that is top of mind for many of us? What guidance do you have about taking our conferences virtual? Opportunity to transform and reinvent, which takes time, versus retool and expedite. So
it really, thank you, Kiki. I appreciate that, adding that in and rereading that question. So as you think about your stakeholders and their needs, you really need to consider what different situations they might be in. Were they coming for networking reasons? Were they coming for a specific aspect of the agenda? How much do they have to invest, both of time in a world where you may be managing children at home at the same time that you're managing your business? How much money do they have to invest? I'm familiar with nonprofits who, interestingly, have had increases in support as a result of COVID-19. So they may have more to invest in a different way of approaching it. But unfortunately, many have less to invest. People are making different priorities. So really thinking, and I think throughout the presentation, there are other examples of how we can think about that example. But as you think about stakeholders, it's easier to group them into one category. They're our members, they're our board members, they're our suppliers, they're our donors, but really drilling down and understanding who they are specifically. And unfortunately, in a world of limited resources, you may have to prioritize among them and really see who is going to be most invested and who's going to take the most time and who will benefit the most, as well as who you can benefit the most. So as you think about those segmentations, think about folks' needs, wants, preferences. We might traditionally think about them as internal versus external, but thinking about them as primary versus secondary, or even influencers might be a different way to think about it, but really prioritizing among your priority stakeholders. And that actually, Jim, leads me to the next slide. So as you think about specifically Dana's example of the conference, as much as we would all like to meet everyone's needs, we need to think in terms of who our core stakeholders are and how we can address their needs and communicate with them. So this is a map that'll kind of help you figure out where to invest your time. So let's start with the top right quadrant, which is really where you want to invest most of your time. There are folks who are interested, passionate, and critically, they can help you engage and influence others. So as you're making decisions, not just about conferences, but about future plans, okay, I've already forgotten the expression, the normal, whatever it is, or the non-normal, or the abnormal. 2 years from now, I'll do it in a time phrasing, but 2 years from now, those are the folks who can help you engage and influence others as today and for the future. Now, if additional capacity exists, then you can start to look at some of those other quadrants. So I'll go to the top left, the latents, and the bottom right, and who are the defenders. They require additional examination to determine how you want to prioritize them. Again, if you're making a decision about a virtual conference versus whether it's safe or whether they have the resources to invest in what it might take to have a safe in-person event. So there might be hidden gems in the defender category where you might want to invest some time in bringing them up to the promoter category. They have a lot of interest, and maybe you can help them increase their influence. On the top left, in the latents, the same applies in that they have a lot of influence or low interest. Are there folks in there who you can increase their interest if it makes sense to do so? If there's something that they don't know about, for example, that might get them more interested, that might be low-hanging fruit to move those folks over to promoters as well. And unfortunately, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on the apathetics because I am apathetic about spending time on the apathetics. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Jim to talk about drivers of the change.
Apathy doesn't require a lot of time, right? Good. So once we've, and it always starts with the stakeholders, the members we serve, the audiences that we're serving, the communities we serve, the folks that we represent. It always needs to start with them. And once we've done that, then we need to understand what's making tomorrow different than yesterday. What's driving change? Clearly, when it comes to the example of meetings, events, of the way we disperse information and the way we think about educational seminars. The pandemic is making things different. Our ability to travel is making things different. The available technology is making things different in the future. The expectations from different generations as it relates to everything we're talking about are all will make things different tomorrow. So we want to brainstorm what's different, what is making change. This is where we ask those why questions. We get to that fifth why, then we really understand what's driving change and what's causing things to happen that Jim Collins always talks about in the planning process. But this is a really important thing because it later on will help us define the actions that we can and should take as an organization to help make those drivers of change either work in our favor or help us overcome them. So this is a really important brainstorm in the process that we need to spend a little bit of time on as both perhaps staff and volunteer leaders. And this is where you want to get some of those good thinkers in the organization, those people who push buttons a little bit to test our assumptions also about what's driving change. Then from that, we need to identify what we know and what we don't know. What is significant about the issue? What do we know about events? We know that right now travel is hard. If we're a global organization in the United States, we have some limitations on where we can go, and we don't know how long that's going to take. Folks coming in, same situation. The unknowns of travel as it relates to education are different if you're a state organization. There may be a different ability to get together. So that becomes a known, but we want to brainstorm what we clearly know about the issue that's important for future implications and what's unknown about the issue or topic we're talking about that has significant future implications. Again, another brainstorm, because once we've put those lists together, then we can identify the kind of action that we need to take as an organization, or we can take. As we mentioned at the top, if we have an issue and we have a lot of things that we know, and there's a high sense of urgency, and we know that that's high impact, then we can start taking a targeted approach. Then we have enough knowledge to start taking action and doing something about that. And so that becomes a type 1, what we're calling type 1 approach, which is targeted, really focused on the choices that we can make, that Sharon will go through in just a minute, on what we can actually do. If there are a lot of unknowns and there's a degree of uncertainty and there are a lot of different things that could happen or different things that could take place, think about the education space right now with public education is going through this. And a lot of the organizations we work with are related to what's happening with public education. They're developing a series of scenarios because they're not quite sure what will be happening with the ability for teachers and students to be in the classroom even a month from now. And so they're going through an iteration of different scenarios because there are enough unknowns that are significant, that are of high impact, that have a high degree of implications on what that future looks like, that we need to develop some scenarios. So now we know we have an issue that has a high degree of certainty. Something's happening. We know what's happening, and we need to start taking action.
Yeah. Kiki, maybe ask the audience to ask us questions about what's impacting their day-to-day. Because we do have a few examples to share today, case studies that we like to talk about. But certainly we want to hear from people that are listening today and what their concerns are.
Yeah, Sharon, I think that's a great idea. And this is an opportunity for those of you who are watching right now. If you want to type into the Q&A and just say if there is a particular situation that you're facing, what you are hearing or worried about within your own organizations right now, just share a couple of your examples, and that way we can speak directly to it and give you a little bit more direct guidance from what we're getting ready to present. That's a great idea, Sharon.
Thanks, Kiki.
Yeah.
When we look at building a single focus strategy, certainly we're building on that knowledge base again. And so we're going back and revisiting some of the things that we discussed under consult, as well as what we understand under comprehend. And I can't emphasize enough that your strategic plan during a crisis doesn't go away, but really should be a guide. And how we use it in this situation is really to identify where the gaps are. So before you start brainstorming solutions, you really need to use your strategic plan to ground your decision making, and then look at the gaps, and then start from there.
I've got a couple of examples already for you, and I'm just going to plug these in here so that you're thinking about them as you move forward. Okay.
Okay.
And the first is from Connie, and she says virtual versus live conference, and I think that there are a lot of people out there who are probably thinking that's exactly where I am too. And then there's also, and Anne writes this, and I know for a fact from conversations I've had that this is definitely weighing heavily on people's minds. The fear that if things continue to get worse, we may have to lay off staff. Then Connie has another suggestion here. I see member well-being. They're dealing with nurses, literally their physical and mental health, endurance, and resilience. So you've got a few examples to work with there.
Okay, so guys, start thinking about that. I'm just going to highlight a few other aspects of the single focus strategy, and then we could deal with those questions. So if you look at step 2, Jim, the next slide, again, design thinking is very important. And it really allows you to brainstorm, no judgment on the ideas. But again, the basis is, what were you thinking when you put together your key strategies and your strategic plan, and where's the gap? So when you come up with these creative solutions, it's really the start of another level of conversation where you look at what is possible. Again, looking back at the advantages and disadvantages, looking at how does it impact capacity. So back to workforce or finance. And I think when you look at virtual meetings, you're really focused on that, the financial impact, sure, and certainly your members. And back to what Jim said earlier about ability to travel. But during this process, you deliberate as a group and you start to prioritize the solutions based on the advantages and disadvantages. So when you get to step 3, you really have built consensus around a single solution, and now you're identifying action steps. And 4 and 5 are traditional steps in most strategic planning processes, where you identify the roles and responsibilities of the individual. You clearly define metrics to evaluate your progress. And what's normally left out is that communication strategy. So Cheryl will talk to us about how to develop a communication strategy, because a lot of initiatives fail because you come up with a bright idea, but you have not communicated effectively internally and externally. So let's go to some case studies, and I'll start with mine, and then Kiki, we could answer some of the other questions. Let's look at changing revenue sources. And what we realize is that during this pandemic, that there's an evaporation truly of traditional revenue sources. And we're in flux trying to meet our financial obligations. And so there is a sense of urgency when we look at revenue sources to meet our commitment, not only to our mission, but to our members and staff. And so the issue that you brought up, it may impact our staff, truly is an urgent and critical issue. So in this particular case, working with a group, understanding that membership dues was their primary source of revenue. And with the changing revenue sources, what could they do? And so they began to brainstorm about the variety of choices they had. And they really looked at things from affinity programs to selling branded merchandise. I know many of us have looked at advertisements and newsletters, but they looked at all of these things and they really explored the advantages and disadvantages. And when you think about new sources of revenue, the most critical piece of this is, does this new program or service align with your association mission, purpose, and value? And by them taking the time to really discuss this and come to consensus, they were able to come up with some changing revenue sources. And in this particular case, the affinity program was something that worked for them, given some of the social justice issues that we're seeing and their membership wanting to be a part of the change, that they saw affinity programs as something that they could take part in, and it would not be in conflict with their association mission, purpose, and values. So let's, Jim, Cheryl, any comments before we talk about possibly virtual meetings or impact on staff?
Yeah, I was thinking about the Q&A and the examples that were given, because those are clearly top of mind for so many of the associations that we're working with, and how to connect with our volunteer leaders, how to connect content to our members at a time that's changing also. And one of the things that's really important that we're talking about, that I've learned going through this, and I think all of us have, is taking that time to really think about what we know and what we don't know about what they're going through, what our members are going through. Thinking about what's driving change for them, thinking about and asking, as Cheryl talked about early on, asking what they are looking for, what their needs are, what their expectations are. But doing that simple process of just asking and listening helps us then think about what's different now. How do we engage them in that space that helps us think about the longer term engagement challenges facing the associations also. So taking a little bit of time to think through that, and using that as a way to identify what we know and what we don't know, to identify a couple of things. One is changes that we need to make right now, which Sharon talked about. Some of those relate to revenue. Some of those relate to the way that we have programs right now. A lot of organizations have gone through changing their programs to virtual. And so there's a lot of learning that's happening. Some have had increased attendance for various reasons. We know that we're going to deal with some sort of hybrid in the future based on the inability to travel even for the next year. The staff issue, man, that is, having been, on association leader and staff person for 25 years, that is and every leader I talk to and coach, that's clearly top of mind. And the important thing is really identifying what we know and what we don't know, and really intentionally thinking, as I'll go through in just a second, what will help, what do we need to understand more to make decisions in the future? Sometimes we can't make a decision now about what staff looks like, about how we engage in the future, about what our volunteer structure looks like, also about what our member needs are. We see a little bit of, professions and trade associations are going through a little bit of different dynamic also, but there are a lot of similarities there. And so really taking the time to think about what we know and what we don't know, and developing some scenarios that help us then say, we need to understand X before we can take certain action. There's this sense that we need to do something, especially when things are flying at us as dramatically as they are right now. But sometimes taking no action now, but thinking through and letting everyone know and being transparent and intentional about what benchmarks we're looking at to make decisions and when we're going to do that is the most important thing, and perhaps the best thing that we can do right now, especially when there's so much uncertainty.
Because we're tight on time, and I'm not sure we're going to make it through the communications part of the presentations. I just want to highlight a few things about staying in touch and making sure that you're authentic, that folks know that you care about them, that you are consistent, and you are transparent. So I realize that it's difficult to say, yes, do virtual, or no, don't do virtual. And wellness is so much a part, particularly for essential employees who are working in this, but authentically caring and staying in touch and listening, as we talked to earlier, and connecting is critical.
Yeah, to your point, Cheryl, I want to make sure that we get to the rest of this. And for those of you who have typed in questions and answers, I feel like there's a little bit more here. So what I'm going to do is ask that the panelists today, we will respond and send everyone who's participating today the questions along with our answers, so that you can see a little bit more in depth about how we would answer if we had more time. So that we can get to the rest of our content today. Let's move on to the next slide, please.
Good. Yeah. And a lot of this will connect with what we just talked about also, because, when we get to that point where we need to develop some scenarios where there are a lot of things that we don't know, and perhaps we feel a need to make a decision right now. One of the things that we're learning also is that we feel like we need to have certainty, but because of the pandemic and because everything is so disrupted right now, there is actually a little more tolerance for making decisions later on or closer to perhaps an event time, because making a decision too soon that you have to go back and change has dramatic consequences. It may make us feel good right now, but the best decision may be to inform everyone transparently, as Cheryl talked about, but to inform everyone, this is what we know, this is what we don't know, this is when we're going to decide things, here's how we're going to make that decision, here's the information that we're looking for, which is exactly what we talk about as we develop these scenarios. So when we think about how we are going to take action in the future, or what those variables are, it's important for us to go back to the information that we develop, the brainstorms about stakeholders and the knowns and the unknowns and the key drivers of change that will make tomorrow different than yesterday. So we have that top of mind before we really begin to develop some of those scenarios. So think about an education program. Scenario one, everyone's able to travel. Everything's wide open. And so we have a meeting that's as it was perhaps 2 years ago. Scenario number two, is some hybrid where certain people are able to get there, but certain people aren't due to different levels of travel or different levels of comfort with travel. And so we have a hybrid scenario. So what are the elements? What are the variables we need to look at that make that happen? And then what actions could we take as a result of that? Scenario 3 is completely virtual. And you go through that same thinking process. And then you think about the time frames involved, the possible actions. We need to take action by X because of a hotel contract. We need to take action by this particular time because we need to develop audiovisual capacity. So we need to identify what those possible actions are so we can think about, those have become some of those key variables so that we think about what possible actions we could take. So this brainstorm is really important. You can do the same thing with board engagement, with thinking about how our leaders are engaged now. What are different scenarios for board involvement? Maybe there are fewer meetings with the large board group, and there's a different kind of action that's taking with a smaller group. Maybe it's segmenting the board in different ways to work on very focused issues that then come together. Different ways of thinking about, but you develop some scenarios and think about what those possible implications are. When you think about what actions you might take, it's important for you to make sure that you're coming back to your mission and vision, your core values as an organization, that you check in to make sure you're not compromising who you are, but you also understand what you can do based on your mission and based on your core values as an organization. It's also important to think about whether actions that you have identified in these scenarios or possibilities will either help you achieve your mission, your vision, and the goals that you've set out, what the implications are. Perhaps timeframes have changed. Perhaps we're seeing some things that are actually escalating the time frame, making things happen sooner than we thought because of this great experiment that we're going through with virtual learning and go back to the healthcare scenario with the way that we interact with patients. So that's an important check-in. And then we want to make sure that actions or check in on whether taking certain action would advantage or disadvantage one stakeholder group over another, particularly with our members, that we make sure we have that intentional look. And these aren't designed to be lengthy conversations, but they're designed to make us, to ensure that we're having these discussions and ensure that we're testing whether the action that we take is within our swimming lane or within our capacity as an organization, and whether it's complementary or in conflict with us as an organization. There are a lot of organizations and places that aren't doing this that are really getting into trouble. And so taking this look is extremely, extremely important. Then once you've done all that, then you start to identify what you can and should do. Cheryl?
I want to emphasize one thing with the scenario planning is that you may not use every scenario.
Yep.
But
it's a brainstorm.
About this is that you have it in your toolkit, and by having a response strategy already prepared makes you confident moving forward. So I just wanted to emphasize that. I'm sorry, Cheryl, go ahead.
Well, in the last 90 seconds, I'm going to power through then where the rubber meets the road as far as actions and accountability. And I like the example that Glenn gave in the Q&A. He almost kind of laid out an action plan around how you might address the needs to or alternatives to laying off staff. And there's steps associated with that. Whether it's something that you're working on now or for the future, this is where the rubber meets the road. You've consulted, comprehended, and constructed, and now it's time to commit. You need to translate all of the work you've done building up this foundation of knowledge. You've created the action plan, timelines, and you need to translate it to documentation. And as Jim pointed out earlier, sometimes when there are more unknowns than knowns, the step is wait. But if so, you need to be really specific about when you will check back, what people will hear, how you move on. So typically people will want to know something, but hearing from you matters. Think in terms of what happened when we stopped hearing as often from the coronavirus task force, as an example. That in and of itself, that lack of connection created concern. So making sure that we continue to connect and communicate is important. And this outlines how you do that, how you set up that accountability and action plan. And very briefly, I'm going to go through the last slide as far as communications and how you stay in touch with folks. We've talked about prioritize stakeholders. It's always critical, even in the quote unquote best of times, to stay in touch, but especially during times of challenge and uncertainty, it's important to stay in touch, particularly with your prioritized primary stakeholders. And then you want to, step 2 is make sure you understand the outcome. You shouldn't just talk for talking's sake. There's a lot of that going on, and we need to make sure that we're really focused on the outcomes that we need to achieve. So what are those outcomes? And then what are the messages that you want to deliver to achieve those outcomes? You need to be clear and engaging. If there's jargon that's relevant to your target audience, then certainly use it, but make sure that you aren't using too much jargon that's internal to you. Make sure, and this is critical, that you include what they want to hear, especially if that's not necessarily what you want to tell them. You can give folks 5 messages, but if they're only going to take away 1 or 2, you have lost control by telling folks too much. So prioritization is critical. We talked about channels earlier, and then test, and Jim mentioned that earlier. It's always good to see how you've done. Listen, follow through, and follow up. And that's something that I would normally have done in a lot longer time period, but I wanted to power through to keep us at least close to being on time today.
Yeah, good, Cheryl and Sharon, thank you. And hopefully what we've given you are some of those steps and an intentional process of thinking and discerning to make sure that the actions that you're taking with things that are happening to you, things that are external that are coming at you, that you go through an intentional process to make sure you're dealing with issues that are really critical, that are really important, and that you're identifying what we know and don't know, and identifying what kind of action we should and can take, and what kind of impact that we can have as an organization. So hopefully you understand that, yes, you do have the bandwidth to do this. Yes, there is a way to do this that does align with your strategic vision and goals as an organization. Doesn't have to take a lot of time, but just checking in on these steps is extremely important to make sure that you're not making assumptions that might lead you down the wrong path, or to make sure you're not missing something also.
I love it. Thank you so much. And, you know, I hope all of you got a lot out of this today. We want to thank you. We went a little bit over, 2 minutes over. That's not terrible, but listen, we have a lot more to share with you. We would love to hear from you. So thanks for joining us for today's session. On behalf of Cheryl, Sharon, Jim, the entire Techer International team. I know I saw Dwayne and Carolyn and Glenn on here. So on behalf of all of us, thank you so much. This is the 3rd Techer International webinar in our special series. The next one coming up is a special one for me. Glenn and I will be talking about building and sustaining a trusting community, which totally ties in to what Cheryl was talking about, with association staff in a virtual or hybrid work environment. That's going to be on August 27th from 2 to 3 p.m. Eastern Time. And so you can register for that webinar by looking for the link in this follow-up email you're going to get that will include the recording from today. It will also include a link to the replay, and then the slides. So look for that. If you got value from today's session, please be sure to let us know. We really value your opinion and your feedback. And share what you learned from this, share it with others, share it with your colleagues, share it on social media. And we hope you have a fantastic, safe, and healthy weekend. All right.
Thank you too, Kiki.
Oh, thank you. Yeah.
Bye.
Bye.